Last week, it was politics and Artemis II preparations, and this week, it's Artemis II preparations and politics. Hey everyone, welcome back. There's more to digest about the Jared Isaacman Senate confirmation hearing last week on April 9th, particularly after NASA's science budget request was leaked right after that. We don't know yet what the Trump White House is going to cut from the Artemis budget, but we can look for the budget from the science programs and the hearing testimony for some clues. But the news this week was about Artemis II preparations, with Exploration Ground Systems working to complete stacking of the SLS vehicle in the Vehicle Assembly Building at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. At the same time, EGS is getting ready to receive the Orion spacecraft from prime contractor Lockheed Martin at the end of this month or early next. Going back to the beginning of the week, NASA Kennedy Space Center Public Affairs published a blog on Monday, April 14th, marking completion of the integration of the SLS Launch Vehicle Stage Adapter, or LVSA for short, with the core stage. The LVSA was lifted and stacked on top of the core stage forward skirt on April 3rd, and the blog reported that hardmate of the elements was completed on Saturday, April 12th. The connection between the core stage forward skirt and the lower LVSA interface is a bolted flange, with 360 bolts fastening them together at 1-degree intervals around the circumference, along with splice plates that are used at larger intervals. This is footage of a splice plate being installed for a different 8.4 meter wide flange between the bottom of the core stage 2 inner tank and the top of the liquid hydrogen tank, but the idea is the same. The connection between the core stage and LVSA is the same type of permanent connection as between the major core stage elements. The area will eventually be closed out with spray-on foam insulation, also the same as the other flanges. Unless Artemis II is canceled, they will stay bolted together throughout the launch, through main engine cutoff and separation of Orion and the SLS in-space second stage, the interim cryogenic propulsion stage, or ICPS. The core and LVSA won't be cleanly separated, but after heading up to the 2,200 kilometer apogee of the insertion orbit, they re-enter the Earth's atmosphere almost 2 hours after launch over the Pacific Ocean at almost 8 kilometers per second, and then they will be disintegrated, and then those separate elements will be disintegrated and destroyed. The ICPS is the next Artemis II SLS element to be stacked, and we learned shortly after the blog post that servicing of the attitude control system hydrazine tanks was complete. That hazardous operation was completed in the Multi-Payload processing facility in the KSC industrial area. ICPS uses hydrazine as a storable monopropellant for attitude control. Completion of hydrazine servicing signaled that the move of the ICPS to the Vehicle Assembly Building for stacking would be soon, and that occurred on Tuesday, April 15th. The United Launch Alliance ICPS was installed in a vertical transportation fixture back at ULA's Delta Operations Center on the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station side of the Banana River. It was moved from there to the MPPF transfer aisle on March 9th for hydrazine servicing. The ICPS retraced some of the route taken in March when it was moved from the MPPF to the VAB. Except this time, instead of being taken into the VAB transfer aisle via the southern low bay entrance, the stage was driven around to the northern entrance that used to be used by shuttle orbiters, going through the old orbiter processing facility bay areas on the way. The Artemis I ICPS was taken through the southern entrance when it was moved to the VAB in June 2021. That was another difference between then and now. Inside the VAB, the stage will be prepared to be lifted out of the VTF and then up into High Bay 3 for stacking on top of the LVSA. The LVSA connects the 8.4 meter wide core stage with the 5.1 meter wide ICPS. At least it's 5.1 meters in diameter at maximum. The top of the LVSA includes a separation system and a frangible joint assembly that will instantaneously separate the ICPS from the adapter without generating any debris from the explosive detonation. Stacking of the ICPS will be the last stacking event for Artemis II for several months. The next piece is the Orion-specific, SLS Block 1-specific payload connector called the Orion Stage Adapter. That is not expected to be stacked until the end of the summer at the earliest. Speaking of the OSA, it is still in storage at the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, and the center published a still image of the OSA units for both Artemis II and III during the past week. This shot shows the Artemis II unit in the foreground right, with the diaphragm installed and the centerline docking target installed in the middle of that. We can also see a few of the secondary CubeSat payload dispensers installed. You can see the OSA for Artemis III inverted in the background, and the diaphragm for that unit can also be seen staged in the building for eventual installation. The critical path for Artemis II launch readiness at this point in preparations is still the Orion spacecraft and getting it ready to stack on SLS. Orion prime contractor Lockheed Martin is finishing final assembly work on the short stack, which includes the integrated crew and service modules and the spacecraft adapter cone. It's been a month since we last got a good look at the spacecraft in these two pictures taken on March 21st and released a few weeks later. These showed the CSM and spacecraft adapter cone with the service module fairings installed being moved back into the final assembly systems test or FAST cell in the Neil Armstrong Operations and Checkout building at the Kennedy Space Center. Lockheed Martin is currently working on 3 Orion builds in the Industrial Operations Zone in the O&C building. The last installation for the Artemis II build originally was going to be the forward bay cover. This is a shot that I got of it back in December before the thermal protection system tiles were covered with silver tape for flight. But as we heard back in February, after the forward bay cover is installed, new to this Artemis II Orion build, the final major installation in the O&C building is part of the launch abort system's motor adapter truss assembly. The ring and feet of the MATA truss will be installed early, so to speak. That installation of the 6 feet includes the retention and release mechanism bolts that are pyrotechnically separated when the LAS is jettisoned during launch. The latest from KSC Public Affairs at the beginning of the week was that, quote, the forward bay cover install preps are in work and handover to EGS is still tracking towards early May, unquote. So we're about 2 weeks away from that major milestone. Once EGS spacecraft offline operations moves Orion to the MPPF, they are planning 3 months there to load all the flight commodities on board. All the fluids from propellants to pneumatic gases to breathing air to coolant liquids. 2 months are planned after that to stack the launch abort system on top and encapsulate the crew module in its part of the launch fairing. Once that work is complete, Orion will be ready to stack on SLS, and an early May handover would point to an early October target for that milestone. On Thursday, NASA published a 15-minute-long B-roll video that covered activities a month ago to mate the Artemis II SLS core stage to the boosters in VAB High Bay 3. The time-lapse video starts back on March 14th when the ground-started sustainer stage was lifted out of Boeing's Core Stage Vertical Integration Center in High Bay 2 by one crane, and then it ends on March 23rd with the stage suspended on a second crane being lowered down in between the boosters in High Bay 3. I recorded a first reaction to the whole video on Thursday, and that's available for members of the channel. The video includes views from new vantage points, since this is only the second time this core stage lift-to-mate operation has been performed. As detailed in videos last month, there were 2 breakovers to move the stage diagonally between these 2 high bays. This is a good overhead view of the first breakover, from vertical to horizontal, to lie the stage back down on its ground transportation carriers on the transfer aisle floor. And then this is what it looked like from there for that first breakover. The stage is almost 65 meters long, almost 212 feet, and it had to be moved a good part or more of that distance to get in position for the second double crane operation. It's another expression of the size of the VAB itself. There's a lot more, but this was another rare vantage point, at least for outsiders, with this camera set up on Platform F in High Bay 3, showing the stage being lowered down in between the boosters. In contrast to the continuous live coverage of SpaceX Starship operations all day, every day, delayed release of footage like this from pretty much everyone else is common in today's export control, limited data rights world. As with this publication of footage from activities over a month ago, it often takes weeks to review and clear for public release. So this is another one of those things that is simultaneously great to have, and at the same time is too late for a 24/7 news cycle. In political news and notes, the fallout from the leak of a late revision to the White House budget request for NASA continues. That was reported in multiple stories published on the morning of April 11th, and it was preceded by soon-to-be NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman's confirmation hearing just 2 days earlier on April 9th. In the next however many weeks until the budget request is finally released, we may see more leaks of final revisions. But the leak of some of the science budget numbers provided some perspective on the confirmation hearing earlier that week. The budget plan for NASA's exploration programs, more commonly branded as Artemis, has not leaked so far, and while we wait to see what the budget request says about them, or for details of the request to be leaked, we can look at the numbers that have been leaked for the Science Mission Directorate, and where Mr. Isaacman testified about that in his confirmation hearing. It may be that Mr. Isaacman was briefed to be careful about making commitments that might not be aligned with the budget request, which is going to be either more or less finished or possibly released before he is officially confirmed. The budget cuts for the Science Directorate were explicitly rumored in early March, and in rumors going back farther than that, so his remark that he reads Keith Cowing's NASA Watch site suggests he's familiar with some of the budget. Reports of an associate of both Mr. Isaacman and Elon Musk, who is already detailed to the acting NASA administrator, is also another separate avenue of communication inside NASA than directly from Mr. Musk. So he may have already known broad outlines of what was coming in the budget, or he didn't want to get ahead of the White House Budget Office, the Office of Management and Budget, commonly known by its acronym, the OMB. In either case, it may be difficult or impossible for him to make any changes to this budget request, which he will inherit when he joins the team. When he becomes NASA administrator, it will become his budget. Eric Berger reported in his story on April 11th that the cuts also appear intended to force the closure of Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland. If we go back to the hearing that occurred before that news broke, Democratic Senator Maria Cantwell, the ranking member of the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, questioned Mr. Isaacman about the possibility of closing a NASA field center, since that had already been the subject of many rumors.
That means that we end up shortchanging it to certain degrees. So I want to make sure I understand what your commitment is, because there's been so much in the press. Do you commit not to closing any of the NASA's 10 centers or divesting from critical infrastructure without the expressed authorization of Congress?
Senator, you absolutely have my commitment to work alongside Congress. I think NASA is going to require the best and brightest from across the nation and all of our critical infrastructure in order to achieve its mission to do the near impossible for all humankind.
Do you see any reason to close these 10 centers?
Senator, there's only so much that I can be briefed on in advance of this opportunity. I fully expect to roll up my sleeves and determine, where all of our best resources are, so we can get back to achieving the mission as quickly as possible.
As he often did in the hearing, he did not directly address the question in his response. Immediately after that, Senator Cantwell questioned Mr. Isaacman about a few of the science budget cuts that were rumored at the time of the hearing.
You might be one heck of a entrepreneur in relation to science. You said you're not a scientist, but that won't matter if we make very bad decisions based on somebody's arbitrary budget analysis instead of what is our long-term mission. So that's what we're trying to get out of you. How do you think we're going to accomplish this so that we have a more, listen, the more we can explain this to everybody, I guarantee you the more my colleagues will support it in a budget. The more it gets slashed and burned by different approaches, by DOGE, the more harmful it can become to people, undermining the support for the mission overall. So you have a big challenge here. It's to move us forward at a critical moment. Where are you? So do you believe that we should have a reduction in workforce or the science budget, some of the things that I mentioned in my opening statement?
Senator, I read what's on NASA Watch and in the news like everybody else. If I'm confirmed, I am eager to understand all of the considerations, the discussions being made about a reorganization. I believe that we are going to need the best and brightest to do the near impossible, and we should be concentrating all of our resources on the most critical objectives that I kind of outlined in my opening remarks, ma'am.
Given that he chose his words very carefully when responding to questions, it leads to the question of whether he was making a distinction in the hearing between science and NASA science. His opening statement referred to science in general, but not specifically to NASA science or the portfolio of NASA science programs. He referred to science experiments conducted on his orbital missions, but those were privately funded missions. Senator Cantwell also asked Mr. Isaacman about a project in the Aeronautics Directorate called HICAM, and his response was ambiguous.
Thanks, ma'am.
There's a lot here. So the HICAM program on thermoplastic composites, do you support that program at NASA?
I think NASA has the best, brightest, most talented engineers and scientists, and we should be working on cutting-edge technology.
Okay, I will want for the record whether you support that. In clarity, not just like, hey, I like cutting edge technology.
As you heard at the end of that sequence, she asked for his response on that for the record. Responses to those questions for the record were due by the close of business on Tuesday, April 15th. However, given the Easter break and Easter weekend, we may not see those posted right away. We'll have to wait until the next hearing to see if there's more clarity, since the budget will be about specific programs and missions being operated by the Science Directorate and the other directorates today. And he will be selling the White House budget to Congress. Congress will draft their own appropriations bills, and it's likely they won't use the numbers that the White House provides verbatim. So that's one of the things we'll be looking for. First, we'll be looking for the president's budget request to be released, and then Mr. Isaacman will appear before the appropriations committees, and then those committees will start drafting bills that include NASA. I got an opportunity many years ago to ask then NASA Deputy Administrator Jim Morehard about a similar situation, where OMB wants to terminate a program or big-ticket item, or many of them. Prior to taking office in 2018, Mr. Morehard served for many years on Capitol Hill, including positions such as Chief of Staff of the Senate Appropriations Committee. More recently, he participated in the transition team between the outgoing Biden administration and the current second Trump term. Back then, in late 2019, the first Trump White House had already proposed defunding or canceling the SLS upgrades from the Block 1 vehicle. At the time, both Exploration Upper Stage and Mobile Launcher 2. We may see that again soon with SLS upgrades in the upcoming budget request, but what he had to say about the process back then is worth considering, at least for those of us who are interested in the process. It applies to the science programs that are being cut this time as well.
Well, so then there's the other question, policy-wise, was about Exploration Upper Stage. So again, the White House proposed in fiscal 2020 defunding it, at least on a temporary basis, and I mean, even Mr. Bowersox, I think, was testifying a couple of months ago about they're still trying to find a plan for how to use that technology when it's when it comes online, but they don't have any firm plans for it. Do you have any sense from the OMB from the OMB or from the White House about? I mean, I know Congress is on board with the U.S. Do you think the White House has changed their mind about U.S. Going forward, for the 21 budget rollout here in a couple months?
Yeah, we've got 150 million in 19. So under a CR right now, all we've got to work with is another 150. Mm-hmm. But I'm also pretty confident that in conference,
right,
Senator Shelby, I'm sure, will persuade the House to, come forward with what we need next with the EUS. again, I don't think that we can expect OMB to all of a sudden say, Shazam, we support EUS. I just don't see that. But also, as a former appropriator, if I'm the OMB guys, I'm going to make the Congress put the money in for it. Okay. I don't have to. I know they're going to do it. So, I mean, part of this is the choreograph of putting the federal budget request, the president's budget request together. And so I can't comment on what 21's going to look like. I'm hopeful that we're going to have a robust budget. But as far as EUS goes, that'll, I understand OMB, whether they put in funds for EUS or not, but historically they don't sit there and capitulate. Mm-hmm. It's usually more of the same, and each year they know more and more that they don't need to put it in the request because they know it's going to get added. Mm-hmm. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It's interesting.
It's inside baseball.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I know you can't comment on it directly on the 21 until it's public.
But I got to tell you, Jim Bridenstine, we both have done everything possible to try to get those funds increased, so that we can, one, get to 24, land in 24, but also have the bipartisan support for all of NASA. Mm-hmm. And so that's really what our goal has been the whole time of trying to put the 21 budget together.
That interview was in early December 2019, and for what it's worth, OMB still prevailed to again defund EUS in the fiscal year 2021 budget that was released in February 2020. We will see whether this Congress puts money back in for some or all of the science programs. But regardless of whether they anticipate a particular reaction, the White House and OMB, the Budget Office, will argue for their budget and their cuts. If you're only interested in the bottom line, then we're still going to have to watch what happens for the rest of this year, because we could see the executive branch take additional actions this time, including impoundment of funds. Ultimately, these are programs that the White House team doesn't care about. The White House is proposing that they be terminated and, as we saw in Trump's first term, they will make arguments why the costs outweigh the benefits, led by Mr. Isaacman. As Marcia Smith noted in her April 11th story for SpacePolicyOnline.com, if confirmed as NASA administrator, he will be expected to champion the president's budget request and dissuade Congress from changing it. If Mr. Isaacman is able to lobby the budget office behind the scenes for some of these programs, we may see in the next budget request how successful he is. But it is unlikely to be until we see the numbers in the fiscal year 2027 request, which is almost a year away. We're still waiting to start the appropriations process for FY 2026, and the lobbying and arguments for that will pick up when the president's budget request is finally released. But you are what you repeatedly do, as the saying goes, and we should expect more of the same next year and throughout this presidential term. In Trump's first term, Congress put the money for EUS back in the budget, and then the White House and OMB took it back out the next year. It's probably not going to look exactly the same this time, but when it comes to NASA policy, until or unless a big compromise deal is struck, we should expect the White House and OMB to be as persistent in pressing their agenda as Congress is in theirs, for Artemis in particular and NASA as a whole. Before wrapping things up, it's worth taking a look at the big picture for Artemis right now, and we're still waiting for the next proverbial political shoe to drop. That's probably the White House budget request, either the official document or another sneak preview that is leaked early. Members of the House and Senate have emphasized and prioritized in hearings over the last several weeks that they want NASA to win a race with China to land the next people on the moon during this presidential term. The Senate confirmation hearing was more explicit about tying that astronauts on the moon goal to the current Artemis plan, which puts the spotlight on safely and successfully executing the Artemis III mission. And that underscores all the things we've been watching for the past few years with all NASA's Moon to Mars programs involved in Artemis III, assuming that the White House doesn't cancel them. At the top of the list is the Artemis II flight test of Orion and SLS, which are flying with a 4-astronaut crew for the first time. Launch preparations are now highly visible, the launch vehicle is almost fully stacked, and the spacecraft is about to begin its launch preps. In order to get to Artemis III by the current mid-2027 target date, NASA has to safely and successfully achieve all the flight test objectives for Artemis II in the next year or so. Next is the status of the most ambitious program, Starship. Starship is a proprietary SpaceX program, and the big question there remains when the Starship technology will be ready to support Artemis III. It's 2 years, almost to the day that I record this, from launch of the first Starship flight test in 2023. Rapid reusability technology takes precedence and remains the primary focus, so the Starship HLS lunar lander falls in behind that priority for the program. For Artemis, first, SpaceX has to fly the critical propellant transfer demonstration, which will involve at least 2 Starship launches to low Earth orbit. Given the issues that the program is debugging with the upgraded main propulsion system of the ship, the secret schedule remains also uncertain. On Artemis III, the Orion SLS launch would be the final one in the sequence. For that launch to fly in mid-2027, Starship would need to be launching tankers to the depot 2 years from now, maybe a little sooner. So we're at what would be a midway point between the beginning of Starship flight testing exactly 2 years ago and 2 years away from when the Starship Artemis launches need to be taking place. The Axiom Space Lunar Surface Spacesuit program's development schedule is also mostly secret. In the past, status updates are being provided by the Government Accounting Office in their annual audit of major NASA programs. We're still waiting to get an update on the critical design review and the major vacuum tests planned ahead of that. For Orion and SLS, not only do they have the Artemis II launch and mission in front of them, but they also have to complete building the major hardware pieces for Artemis III. The Orion spacecraft and SLS core stage for Artemis III are making progress, but it's not clear when those builds will be completed. Stacking and launch preps for Artemis II are expected to take most of this year, 2025. If that holds for Artemis III, then that unfinished hardware will need to be finished by mid-2026 for a mid-2027 launch. That gives them maybe a little more than a year to finish those builds, which still have a lot of assembly and production work to go. Looking at what's next for the rest of April is probably more of the same things that were news this week: Artemis II preparations and politics watch. We don't have a schedule for stacking of the Artemis II ICPS, but that could happen soon. We're looking for updates on the Artemis II Orion status too, since that currently sets the pace for readiness to launch, and is said to be nearing completion of final assembly in perhaps the next 2 weeks. Another Mobile Launcher 2 umbilical tower module was moved to the construction site in the VAB area, Module 7, so that could also be stacked in the coming days. Thanks for watching. Click on the like button if you found this video informative, and consider subscribing to find out what's going on with Artemis every week. If you're willing to make a one-time donation to support what I do, I would really appreciate it. I put a link to my Buy Me a Coffee page in the description. Your donations will make it possible to make more field trips to NASA centers and contractor facilities here in the US. I also recently added memberships to this YouTube channel, and I want to thank all the people who have joined so far. I am posting more frequent updates on what's happening during the week, and also additional videos, such as the reaction to the 15-minute B-roll video I noted earlier that NASA published on Thursday. If you're interested, I included a separate link to join in the description, but you can also click on the Join button on this page above the description, and there's also a place to join on the channel homepage. Thanks as always for your support.